Sounds good.
All right. Hey, everybody. Welcome back to our January monthly virtual EAP networking group. We're super excited to have, let me see if I can get this right, Sarah Schlote.
Yeah, rock on.
Right.
Well done.
Yeah. Sarah has so many talents, one of which is her business EQUUSOMA, which includes somatic experiencing. So we're really excited to have you here, Sarah. So if you'd like to take the time to introduce yourself, and
Cool.
we'd love to hear what you have to say and what you're presenting today.
Sounds good. Thanks so much for putting this together, Lindsay. I think it's really great to have this opportunity to get to know the who's who and get to know each other. And sometimes it's like the networking allows us to make connections that provide support and, opportunities to collaborate or opportunities to bounce ideas off each other. So I think this is a pretty cool,
It's so important.
pretty cool thing. Yeah. We so often feel like ivory towers in our own little worlds doing this work. And it's so easy to become isolated and then think you're alone and then sort of, go out there, and it creates a lot of, fragmentation in the community and in the work. So I love that you've created this. So thank you again.
Oh, thanks for having us.
Yeah, very cool. So what would be helpful to start? Just a little bit about my background, or what would be important?
I'd love to hear about your background, and then
Cool.
EQUUSOMA, and it looked like you've added a horsemanship component as well. And I'm obviously interested in both, and I know our viewers are too. But I have an 8-month-old colt who's a therapy horse in training, and definitely using the natural lifemanship principles, but also what you have to offer, so I can really work with him in the best way possible using these principles.
Cool. So the horsemanship side of things is still, I would say, being developed.
Okay.
But the principles in question that we teach in the EQUUSOMA program apply across the board, because a lot of the work that I do is focused on early developmental stuff, attachment rupture, attachment repair, all the nervous system stuff, and looking at the impact of early adversity on development and growth and capacity and dysregulation, all that kind of stuff, which of course we know about from the natural lifemanship model, Bruce Perry's work. This is not unknown information. So it's about coming in with that perspective and adding in some extra pieces from a few different therapy models that I really like. So maybe I'll talk a little bit about my background first, just in general.
Yeah, let's do that.
Know who I am, and then I'll talk a little bit more about the EQUUSOMA model.
Yeah, perfect.
So one of the things I like to say to people up front is I am one of those folks in the equine assisted whatever field that you want to call it. Equine assisted whatever is my affectionate name for it. And one of the things I like to say to people up front is I'm not someone who does this full time. And people often think, oh, EQUUSOMA is my full-time gig. It's not. And it's really important that people understand that, because as we learned from the Natural Lifemanship Conference and talking with different people, it's often very challenging to make a go at this kind of work full-time. Especially if you don't own your own facility. And we unfortunately have this misfortune, or the good fortune, I guess, depending on how you look at it, of not being able to afford a farm, because farms are really, really quite expensive in the area where we live. And they're not at all something you can just go out and buy. I mean, we're talking over $1 million for just a basic property, very small acreage. So it's one of those things where currently we do it part-time. A couple days a month currently, and in the past it has been more than that. In the past it's been much more days a month than that, but currently I have to work around my private practice. So my background is a master's degree in counseling psychology, and I am a somatic experiencing practitioner. I'm also trained in EMDR, currently doing training in brain spotting. I've also done training in using touch and table work within the context of body-oriented psychotherapy and attachment psychotherapy, so trained in touch work. And also trained in parts work. So I have some exposure to internal family systems, and also a fair amount of training in the structural dissociation model of working with internal parts or ego states. And on top of that, a whole bunch of other little bits and pieces here and there that kind of inform the work. As you go along, you gather bits and pieces like Velcro along the way. So, but that would be my sort of my large body of work and knowledge that I come from. And that material informs the work I do with the horses. My entry into the horse related world was a number of years ago, back when like natural horsemanship was all the rage. And now there's been a lot of movement sort of around looking at equitation science and what's going on with regards to understanding positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement, the appropriate use of conditioning and all these kinds of things in training, beyond just using pressure release work. But back when I first got started, it was all about the Pirellis and the Monty Robertses and all them. And it's kind of morphed and shifted since then. You know, we've kind of learned a lot more. But I got exposed to the field of equine assisted whatever back in those days. And I did my training in a model called equine facilitated wellness. And what was really interesting, this is out of Canada, and the model I did actually was really cool because I was just starting my somatic experiencing training. And that model draws extensively from somatic experiencing, which I thought was really interesting. But the person who developed it wasn't trained herself in SE, but trained in a similar therapy model to the SE model. It's kind of like an offshoot. And it was really lovely to do training in the modality I was learning. And I realized as I went along, I was like, gosh, you know, there's so much amazing theoretical material, practical material out of the SE training model that explains what we're seeing with the horses. Especially because somatic experiencing is based on the neurobiology of nervous systems, and nervous systems under optimal, natural, quote unquote, conditions, and then nervous systems under conditions that are not so optimal. And I think to myself, okay, well, that's humans, but that's also horses. And when you start to understand horses through the lens of nervous system, the lens of attachment, the lens of all that neurobiology, as we know from natural lifemanship and the Bruce Perry stuff, I go, wow, you know, there's so much pieces here that I think that are really helpful. And so why not formalize that? So a few years ago, I approached the Somatic Experiencing Trauma Institute and said, hey, do you have any interest in us combining, you know, equine stuff and SE in some sort of way? And they were absolutely supportive of the process. So here we are today. And looking at how do we integrate this stuff into it. So it does have offshoots and interest for horsemanship, but it's not something. Last year we piloted a 1-day, 2-day training as a way of sort of gauging the material. Certainly a lot of interest, but we're gonna keep developing that material and see how that goes after that. But there is a lot of application of SE to things like, you know, increasing our intensity when we're asking for connection, and what happens in the nervous system as we bring up our energy. Something starts to happen. And I get really curious about what are we coming into contact with within ourselves that is becoming challenging as we're starting to increase that intensity. And then are there other things that we need to be looking at first? Like, is it always about increasing the intensity of the ask, or is it about setting the conditions so the horse feels safe wanting to come and spend time on its own terms, as opposed to it always being about a request that we're making, right?
That's fascinating.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So I was wondering about what would be helpful today, Lindsay, because there's a lot I could talk about. And I wondered if it would make sense to put it out there to a few of the people who are here, if they had any questions, like what is EQUUSOMA about, or if they wanted to know a little bit more about the training. Maybe we could put it out there to folks and see what they had to say, or if you had any questions, and then I'll use that as a jumping off point. And if there are none, I have a few planned.
Yeah, Kathy, go ahead.
Yeah.
So my, I guess my experience with somatic experiencing is, I watched the video that you, of the conference that you did last time.
2017.
And yes.
Mm-hmm.
And I was completely fascinated. And then I realized that actually probably in 2012, maybe a long time ago, I had gone out and done some equine guided stuff in California. And I remember one of the first things she said was, just go out into the arena and go where your body tells you. And I was like, what the hell? And it took me the whole, because it was a 5-day thing. It took me 4 days before I finally was like, okay, I think I get what this is. I don't, but it was completely foreign to me.
Right.
And which I guess is good, because then I can understand when it's completely foreign to other people.
Yeah.
So that's just sort of my understanding of it. And I'm just always fascinated to learn more about how to make it more real to people, and how to explain what it is and what they're doing and the value of it, maybe.
Cool, sure. And so what I'll start off by saying is that EQUUSOMA is but one version of how to integrate somatic experiencing into working with horses. This is just a formalized attempt at making it a thing. And so there's a lot of people out there over the years who've done somatic experiencing training and have incorporated that into their version of equine assisted, whatever you want to call it. And so when we teach EQUUSOMA, there are more structured, I hate to call them activities, but we all know what we mean by that. It doesn't mean that we're forcing the horse into being a tool. The activity is the relationship building. I'm using that word with the idea that the horse is part of the process. It's a participant. I don't view the horse as a therapist. I don't view the horse as a co-facilitator. I don't view the horse as a tool or an object. They're participating in a process, and they can choose not to participate if they don't want to. And so for me, they're a participant just like the human participants are participants. Main reason for that is that a horse isn't a therapist. They don't have regulatory bodies, and they don't understand about ethics and guidelines. And if a therapist or facilitator wanted to walk away from a client mid-session, they wouldn't be allowed to, but a horse could. You know, if a horse really wanted to walk away, they have that choice. No human facilitator could drop a human client like that. And so I kind of view them as participants. That's just my own personal bias around language. But there's so many different versions of it. And so there might be activities that are more unstructured, like what you experienced, where it's like, okay, so if you go in, it sounds like that's almost like EQUUSOMA style reflective activity, where you listen to what's happening in your body, and then you follow whatever impulse or thing that you're noticing happening in your body. It's a little bit more than just that. So let me see if I can explain what it's about. So SE is, there's a reason why it's taught over 3 years. It's rather a complicated method, but it's really also very intuitive and very elegant at the same time. The idea with SE is when we're not able to successfully mobilize a self-protective response, that is, if something happens and we're not able to fight effectively or flee effectively, or I'll add in these other pieces because we use social engagement strategies to keep ourselves safe as well. If we're not able to find resources or protection or comfort, or if we're not able to fawn, right? Appeasement behaviors are not successful in getting the thing to stop. Then we go into a freeze response, freeze or fold, faint, feign death, fragment, etc. There's all these F's that happen with the freeze response. And so when we're not able to move through and mobilize successfully, a whole host of things starts to happen, because when you think about it, the nervous system is meant to mobilize a response, and that response is intended ideally to be successful. And then when we're successful, whatever energy was mobilized in the nervous system to help us be able to meet the needs of that response, we use it up and it comes out of our system. What goes up must come down. And when we're not able to use that up, if we are not able to self-protect, find resources, appease the threat, fight or flee effectively, we go into a bit of a shutdown. And then there's this sense of I can't, this sense of, I was powerless, I was helpless, and nothing I did mattered, nothing had changed the circumstances. And sometimes we get kind of stuck there. And so any future experience that we have that puts us in touch with a fight or flight response can put us into touch immediately with the helplessness and the shutdown and all those kinds of pieces. And then we're perpetually sort of stuck in perpetual cycles of I can't. So part of SC, not entirely, is how do we work through the thwarted responses? How do we reconnect our bodies with the parts of ourselves that we're not able to mobilize, and work through the mobilization that's left in the nervous system? So an example would be, and it's funny because the body, what Bessel van der Kolk will say, the body keeps the score. You can tell where the trauma is based on the pain patterns and the clenched jaw and like the shoulder shudder and somebody's got this weird shoulder twitch, and they might be somebody might say, oh, you've got Tourette's syndrome, or you've got like some sort of shoulder muscle thing. And it's like, well, actually this might actually be an incomplete movement that never had a chance to finish. Right? The tendency to hold your breath and grip in your diaphragm, it might be scary to let go of your diaphragm, because then you have to face a certain amount of feelings that you weren't able to face, and it's not always about completing a self-protective response. Sometimes it's when we're really, really small developmentally, we can't really mobilize a fight or flight response super effectively because our limbs are kind of, worthless. When you're an infant, you can't really run and you can't really fight. So the mobilization that we have is the attachment cry. It's the calling out to somebody to come and soothe us and make it better. And if we cry and that mobilization doesn't result in someone coming, we shut down. And so whether it's an early developmental thing, or it's a later thing where we had to physically mobilize, or it's an attachment thing where it's like my needs are not getting met, sometimes it's really scary to dip into emotion. It's really scary to dip into an ask, like, will you meet my needs? I think of natural lifemanship and the asks that we make of the horses sometimes. And to raise one's energy, whether it's asking for something, asking for help, voicing a need, being vulnerable, increasing pressure or intensity, that puts people into contact with stuff that they might not want to feel, because it means coming into contact with what's underneath the shutdown. Right? If I'm not able to mobilize effectively, or no one's coming when I call, I go up into a freeze and I never really come down from that. I might just live in a perpetual state of non-feeling, numb, being a good girl, good boy, appeasements, da-da-da-da-da. And so with SC, what's really neat is we're working with helping grow the window of tolerance for being with a little bit more, and a little bit more, and a little bit more. Because what happens is that what goes up never went down. If I was a little infant and no one came and supported me when I was crying, all I know is to activate and then shut down. There's hyperarousal and hypo, hyperarousal and hypo. There's no mid-range. So we're wanting to help build the window of tolerance to be with what's there. And then suddenly we're able to mobilize, and maybe it's like I'm terrified of having my fight response. I'm super passive in the world, and I can't ever stand up for my needs, because to stand up for my needs puts me in touch with my fight response. And that's terrifying, because I don't want to be like my great Uncle Ted, because, great Uncle Ted was an abusive whatever, and I don't want to be like that. So there's an association. And so I disconnect from my fight response, or I'll get punished if I fight back or voice something, or I'll get rejected. And so can we be with the activation associated with the thing until it resolves? And then it's like, oh, and then I've just opened my window of tolerance just a little bit more. And then let's do a little bit more. So it's like, oh, I remember having a client as an example, terrified of having a voice. And even just the idea, the mental image of making a fist, terrifying. Just completely would send them into dissociation and shutdown and like fragmentation and terror, just sheer terror, because having a self-protective response was actually very punished when she was growing up. And so even just the idea of like making a fist or raising the intensity up a little bit was just like, whew, let alone like, can we take the rope and like, move towards the horse's hind end, and like, forget that, that's way too big. For that particular individual. We got to start way smaller. And so the same thing applies with horse nervous systems too. We often ask horses to go beyond their threshold. And we've often learned with trauma to override our own thresholds all the time. We had to do stuff. We had to deal with something that was overwhelming. We had to go beyond our own needs to appease somebody else. We all know about overriding. We live in a culture where school forces us to sit in our desks and wait till the bathroom break. And, there's a certain amount of overriding that's functional. And then there's a certain amount of overriding that is all about like surpassing our own window of tolerance. And then we realize we've been over functioning for years, and then we can't do it anymore because we're in adrenal fatigue and all these kinds of things. And it's like, oh, horses do that too. Horses will do stuff because they're complying or they're appeasing, right? Or they're shutting down and dissociating because that's the only option out. There was no way out. And how do we recognize the thresholds for the horses? When did we cross a threshold? When did we create a reenactment in the horse-human relationship that's just a recreating of a pattern? Is a horse willingly coming with us, or is it because it knows it's going to do that, and if that's what's going to please the humans, and then that way we won't get upset? You know, it does what's expected of it. And so there's all these little nuancy pieces, and how do we integrate that into the work? So it really slows the work down, not just for the human, but also for the horse. How do we support the horse's nervous system capacity too? So it's kind of a neat way of looking at it.
Wow. Okay. So that is way deeper and way more cool than I thought it was.
Yeah. It's really, really
That's
interesting.
just like makes me drool. It's so fascinating.
Yeah. That's why when you said, well, somebody went out into a pasture and they said, just follow what your body sensations are. I'm like, well, that's one version of what somebody who's trained in SC might do. Right. But to me, I go, but that's just like, there's so much more to it than just that. Right. So to me, it's more like, how are we tracking the human and how are we tracking the horse? And as I approach the horse, what's happening in my body, what's happening in the horse's body, and when did we cross a threshold, and do we back up? And then people are like, but if you reduce the pressure when the horse didn't give you what you wanted, you taught the horse that you're reinforcing it to not give you what you want. And I go, why is it about that? What about a horse that has always learned that you're only ever going to release the pressure when you give it gives you what when it gives you what you want? What about a horse for whom connection is terrifying? What about a horse who dissociates at the idea of someone even walking into the paddock, right? I've seen horses that do that. I was at a training once last year, and there was a horse that would shut down. Like the second anyone approached the gate, this horse was like by the edge of the fence and like completely, tuned out. And what was interesting was doing the opposite of what you think. It wasn't continuing to ask until the horse gives a little tiny indicator of something that you're looking for and reinforcing the appropriate behavior. It wasn't about star charts and giving stars. It was about, oh, I'm recognizing the threshold. Okay, great, cool. Okay, there's the threshold. I'm going to back off the second I get a response. Even if that response is, oh, okay, wow, that was too much, because there's the attunement to the levels of tolerance. There's a time and place to keep increasing pressure with the asks and then releasing the pressure when you get the thing that you want. But before that, if you've got a horse, in my opinion anyway, who's been through trauma, who shuts down in relation to connection, to keep increasing pressure, I don't know that that's necessarily going to be the thing that makes them want to approach. Mm-hmm. If you show attunement, and in SC, it's all about the attunement to the minor signs of thresholds. If I can find the threshold and then put in the pressure, find the threshold, and then back off a little bit and let that threshold come down, it's like, oh, okay, I see. There's that sign of dissociating. Let's back up a couple steps here. As opposed to, I'm just going to keep asking pressure, and so they stop dissociating on me. They can't control the dissociation, right? That's not a wanted thing. That's like an automatic behavior. So if I show the horse, hey, it's not about you giving me what I want, it's about me attuning to what your thresholds are. The horse might go, oh, that animal over there, that weird looking primate actually sees me. Because so many horses show these calming signals. They show these little indicators that they're not comfortable. They can't speak English or Dutch or German or French, but they show us through their body language. And if we miss that, that's a misattunement. We misattune to horses all the time. And a lot of human developmental trauma is misattunements, right? The kid is feeling upset and the parent doesn't see the upset. And so the kid learns to shut down, and the kid learns, well, grown-ups aren't trustworthy. And then we develop insecure attachment because of the misattunements. How much of horse-human interaction problems are because humans are misattuning to the horses, and the horses go, see, another human who doesn't get me. I'm just going to write that one off too. Right? Yeah. So before the asks, to me anyway, in my personal opinion, before we do the asking, I kind of go, where's their boundary? Where were the ruptures in that relationship? where the rupture is in that horse's boundary, that when I start to approach, that horse starts to tune out. And it might be that some horses you can do the asking right away, but it might be some horses you got to do the reverse. You got to show them the attunement, and that you're picking up on their no and their no and their no. And every time they give a no, you're like, yep, okay, got it. I see your no. I'm backing the heck off. And then they go, oh, that animal sees my no. I might show some interest because my no is being acknowledged. But that's a way slower way of working, though. If we have a goal and it's about time frames, then we're going to want to be going the faster route. But then what is it that you're wanting, right? So there's a time and place for doing the whole release the pressure when the horse gives you the thing you want thing, but there's also a place for release the pressure when the horse says no. And the slightest, smallest indicator of a no, and that's when the heck you back off. Mm-hmm. And then the horse goes, okay, so I'm not just screaming into a vacuum here. They actually saw that, And then,
how does this, so like if you're working with a horse, mm-hmm. So what does that balance look like, right? Yeah. Do you just say, okay, this time I'm going to approach, acknowledge the no and back off, or maybe I back up for a few steps and I just sit there for an hour.
Yeah.
And then other times it's like, no, I'd really like to be in a round pen and to do like maybe to push the threshold a little bit. Yeah. So, I mean, is that what it looks like, or what does that look like?
Yeah. So from a training standpoint, bear in mind, I haven't been able to sample size this with too many horses, right? This is somatic experiencing is a neurobiological model based on mammalian psychophysiology applied to humans that I'm trying to bring back around to other mammals, right? So hence, one of the issues with not having your own farm, it's really tough to test this out on more than one or two subjects because you've just got your own farm, right? You've got your own horses at a boarding facility. But I have used this with my own horse, and this is what I found so fascinating about it. With my own horses, it's been really cool to see, and other people who ascribe to these ideas that I've been promoting have also been testing this out with their horses. So we're getting a lot of anecdotal kind of review. And because it's based in mammalian psychophysiology, I go, well, there's something to this because it's coming out of a mammalian model. So it's not coming out of my arse, right? This is something that actually exists in science. So how are we applying it? The question, or the answer to your question, I think, is going to be complex. So it depends on the horse. It depends on your goals, right? For me, because I'm not pressured for time, I'm not in any kind of discipline, right? Like my horse, we started him for riding. He got started too quickly with a trainer who overwhelmed him. He developed a fear of objects. He became very flighty. And then started many years of problems, right? Where we couldn't do stuff. Thank God I'm not in a discipline because it didn't matter to me. I wasn't under time frames to go win ribbons, and anything like that. So it didn't bother me that we could take our time, right? He's going to be turning 9 this year and our relationship is better than ever. Has he been ridden in 4 years? Nope. But for me, the relationship is everything with this horse. And the fact that he will willingly come and find me in the dark when I enter the pasture in the dead of winter, because we get pretty darn cold and pretty darn dark up here in Canada in the wintertime. And when I walk out there in the dark at night and it's 7:30, 8 o'clock and it's pitch black and I walk into the pasture and he sees me coming from a mile away and he comes up and finds me in the dark, it's worth it to me. Because I go, we took the time. And what's the expression? You take the time it takes, so it takes less time, right? So one of the things I had to do with him was back the heck off of negative reinforcement. It's important that a horse understands pressure release, appropriate timing of pressure and release, because that's a thresholds thing. I love SE because SE really talks to you about how do you monitor thresholds if you're doing pressure release work. Because SE is kind of like little pressure releases. It's what we do. Right? In SE, it's like, oh, so as you talk about your partner's reaction to the thing that happened, what do you notice happens inside? And that's a little poke. The invitation to track what's happening in the body is a little pressure. And then we back the heck off and we just track that until it deactivates, right? As opposed to flooding an individual out, right? And with pressure release methods within sort of horse training or horsemanship, one of the drawbacks to negative reinforcement is that if the timing is not appropriate, if we do not release the pressure at the right time, we can create confusion, we can create flooding, it can be misused. And that's one of the sort of the drawbacks of this pressure release stuff. Should horses know how to move away from pressure? Absolutely. That's what happens when you're in the saddle. You put your leg against their side or whatever, and it's all about sort of really finessing release from pressure. Ideally on the ground. If you're standing on the ground and you want your horse to back up a little bit, ideally you're able to do that in a really gentle, mild, subtle way without having to yank on the horse and manhandle them, right? We want to have some of that subtlety in that feel. And there's other things that are helpful too. Brando, my gelding, who was terrified of everything, I learned clicker training last year. Oh my gosh, he's a different animal. Like, it's been so great. So there's a place for all these bits and pieces. And so for me, taking the time it takes was part of that. Part of it was recognizing the thresholds and, okay, am I overdoing it? My horse, he's a draft cross. The trainer he was with previously did stuff too quickly. My draft cross needs time to think. He's a little slow. He's not stupid. Definitely not a stupid horse, but his brain is a plow horse brain, right? It's clunk, 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 clunk. You're wanting me to do what? Okay, my bum goes this way. Like he's not, he's kind of a slow and stocky guy. He's got a lot more sensitivity now. If the second I look at his rump and he moves his bum, he's got a lot more sensitivity and feel, but he's not the fastest horse on the planet. He's a little chunky, and he's needs time to think about what I'm asking him. The previous trainer would overwhelm him. Flood, 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 flood. You're not doing it. I'm going to keep increasing pressure until you do it. And that would freak my horse out. And then my horse learned to be scared because things were happening too fast, too quickly. And that's the SE point, is trauma is when something happens too fast, too quickly, that I'm not able to effectively mobilize a useful response. And when I'm not able to effectively mobilize a response to get the thing to stop, then I go into shutdown, or I remain in hyperarousal, or we end up getting into these stuck states. And then it's like, my horse was, the trainer kept having to use a heavier and heavier hand with my horse. And my horse kept getting worse. And people would tell me, well, Sarah, you just need to get on him. He's a stubborn horse. Yeah, he's got a little bit of stubbornness. His personality is kind of like that. But how much of that is stubborn and being kind of a plow horse? And how much of that is fear? Right? A resistant client, a client that's digging in their feet, I go, that's a really important no. Rather than continue to dig in the feet and go, well, you're being resistant client, I can't work with you until you're no longer resistant. I might go to that client, it sounds like it's really important right now that we stop, and that you're telling me something about that this might be too much. So thank you for telling me that. What's happening inside as you hear me acknowledge the fact that we need to take a stop here, right? I notice their jaw start to clench. I recognize their nervous system is starting to shut down. They're starting to look away. They don't answer my question. It's like, it sounds like there was something about that question that was too much. What's happening inside? How did you know it was too much? Like, validate the fact that they knew it was too much. Often we override the boundary. People have learned to go along, and then they're called resistant because they were never allowed to have a no. I've noticed that the more I allow the no, the more I get yeses, because I'm offering choice. So I'll answer your question a little bit, Kathy, because I hear your question too, which is, well, and yours too, Lindsay, which is, well, what if you want to go and do this? What if, I want to go do some stuff about raising intensity in the round pen? And I go, well, is the relationship in place? What's the relationship like? I would hope that kind of activity is being done in the context of a relationship that feels safe. If I'm going into the round pen and raising intensity, just get this horse to move around me in mindless circles for no reason, like, I would kind of hope that that's done because the horse has a connection with me. It's not just some mindless activity that the horse goes and shuts down about, and I kind of think to myself, okay, and also about raising the thresholds, does that horse know that it can go, say, into a trot and increase its intensity itself without it being a flight response? Can you tell the difference between a trot and survival energy, right? Is that horse in fear as it's in the round pen or not, right? And so for some animals, it's a really tricky, narrow margin, How can you tell that you've reached that threshold? How can you tell that they're starting to get flooded and go into fight or flight, right? Not all running in a round pen or not all trotting in a round pen is going to be a flight response energy in the terms of the survival response. If there's enough connection, if there's enough social engagement and trust in the relationship, that will moderate the sympathetic charge of the nervous system so that running is happening in connection. This is where I love the polyvagal theory. It's like, okay, not all gas pedal is bad, but you can blow past a threshold. Just like you can also go under threshold and have nothing to work with and never make any asks of the nervous system ever, and then you never actually grow that window. Too much stimulation is just as bad as not enough. So we do want to work with some, right, Lindsay?
Yeah.
So the answer to your question shortly is, if there's connection, if that horse has the capacity to be with some bigger thresholds, if that horse is able to increase charge or explore things and still remain in connection, remain present, have at her. I mean, I don't see any issues with round pen stuff. But for me also, round pen, it's interesting. Round pen is a bit of a North American cultural thing. They exist in other places,
Right.
but it's very much a trend that you see mostly in North America. You go to Europe, there's a few places with round pens, like bull pens and stuff. Like there are some countries that have it, but in a lot of places it's a square pen. And there's a reason for that. So the horse can get away. The horse can say no. The horse can go into a corner and then you can't get at the horse. And the horse gets to have more of a voice in a square pen than in a round pen. In a round pen, it just keeps running until you release the pressure and then it comes in to appease. Right.
That's interesting. Now we just put a round pen up and I can easily make it a square pen.
I'm not maligning round pens, but like when I think of, because they can be a really,
though.
it is really important. If we're thinking about trauma-informed care and we're thinking about trauma-informed practices and we're wanting to walk the talk around things like choice and voice and control and empowerment and all these things, and we're going into a round pen, and the round pen doesn't have any corners where a horse could actually say no, and get away. Are we really offering choice and voice and control? Not quite. Not in my opinion, but that's just Sarah, right? Like that's just me. It's my opinion, my bias, right? I'm not saying we can't use round pens in the context of equine facilitated whatever work. I absolutely think you can, but bear in mind how much of round pen work is a horse knowing what's expected of it and either choosing to go along with it because it knows that's what's expected of it. And if I just do this thing, I'll walk around with them, they'll be happy, and I'll get to go back out to my horse friends and eat. Is it actual connection, or the horse just choosing to do it because it knows that's what it's like a program, right? Is it actually doing a join up, if you want to call it the join up, the connection walk, the whatever you want to call it thing, where you create a connection and then you're walking off lead, and it's so beautiful and it's so lovely when that happens, and I get it. And then I go, and sometimes is that an artifact of the circumstance?
Right.
Because here's the thing we know about horses. They have a stronger attachment bond to fellow horses than they do to people. My theory about this, and this is why I want to do my PhD with the researcher that I've selected to do my PhD with, because she researches attachment dynamics in horses and attachment in horse-human relationships. My theory about it is that we find attachment to those with whom we feel attunement and all these things, but attachment is also about protection. How do I feel protected and soothed? I'm going to feel most protected with others of my own kind who can protect and soothe me. Horses have really big, long bodies. They bunch for protection so they can flee together in unison. Numbers provide safety. I've got a piddly little, primate body. I cannot protect a horse physically worth squat, right? Between me and another horse and that horse's herd, they're going to pick another horse any day over choosing to be with me in the face of danger. I'm not saying there are not exceptions to that rule, right? That you can't build a good relationship with your horse. But if there's something happening, those horses are all going to go off together. They're not going to go, oh, where's the humans? Let's just hang out with them while this cougar shows up, right? They're not. They're just not, right? So between choosing a human and choosing another horse for connection, they'd rather choose another horse. They did some interesting studies around a horse in an uncomfortable situation, like, you know, imitating like an injection, like a, you know, a medical kind of procedure. And they did the different circumstances. They did it without a horse present, like a horse friend present, and they did it with a horse friend present. And in both cases, there was a human observer present also that the horse could connect with. When the other horse was present, the horse did not seek out the human's contact really much at all. But when the other human, like the horse companion, was absent and was out in the herd and the horse was there alone with the human, it vocalized more, it paced more, and it sought out the human for connection more, which is really interesting. So in a round pen, when the rest of the herd is not there and the horse joins up with the human, is it doing so because it's a surrogate attachment figure, like a security blanket, right? It's a transitional object. What's the next best thing I can connect to? Is it because I'm really developing attachment, or is it because that's the closest thing that's available, right?
Wow.
And this is where I go, a true test of it would be, do that out in the pasture.
Yeah.
Right? Why are we doing this in a round pen? Yes, the horse is more focused on the human, but then what does that say? Right? I'm not saying it's wrong again. I'm just asking people to think about it a little bit. Right?
That's a really good thought. I've made an effort with my little guy, not always like just to go out there, give some carrots and be with him.
Yeah, yeah.
And then other times I'll take him out and let him graze and then put him back. And then other times I'll take him in and we're working on picking up our hooves to get our hooves picked. Right.
Totally.
So I'll show him the tools that I'm going to use and let him sniff them.
Yeah.
And, you know, go until tolerated and then, you know, let's go do something fun that you like to go do. But, and I just realized as you were talking, after we were done with carrots tonight, because I didn't take him out or anything, he decided to come over and he let me know he wanted to be itched.
Yeah.
And so, I sat there and I just itched and itched and itched on him, and he just hung out until he was done, and he was like, okay, thanks, bye. He went off with his horse friend, and I was like, oh my gosh.
Yeah. See, and that's the beauty of it, right? And then you can build relationship from there.
Yeah.
But I kind of go, it depends on what your goal is, right? So I took a course once on looking at horse behaviorism and how to understand horse behavior and what precedes the horse behavior. And it's really aligned with somatic experiencing. It was so cool to do that class. Different in some ways, but in some ways very similar. And I remember thinking to myself, again, it depends on what your goal is, because your goal as a human primate may differ from the horse's need or the goal you have with the horse. So for instance, somebody might say, okay, well, Sarah, how do I help work with this horse's fear of objects, but my goal is I want to go and do this dressage thingy-mabobber and yada, yada, yada. And I go, okay, but when is the dressage thingy-mabobber? Well, the dressage thingy-mabobber is in 4 weeks. Well, like, you know, like what is the primary goal here? You know, if you're wanting to do the thing for the dressage thingy-mabobber, then you're going to want to have to scale your expectations about what you can do in those 4 weeks, right? And so if you're preparing your little guy to be in the equine therapy program or equine assisted, whatever program that you're offering, then also, again, think about what your long-term goal is. There's this goal to have him in the program if he's willing to do that. Some horses, it's really not for them. You know, and how do you expose him to the work? Is he observing over a fence? Does he see what the other interactions look like? How are you modeling safe and appropriate respective boundaries while also at the same time teaching him about what it's like to have, you know, touch and lifting of hooves and all these kinds of bits and pieces, right? And the thresholds too, right?
Yeah.
And I remember go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, you know, we have the round pen in the field, right?
Yeah.
And I want to do, when it's appropriate to do round pen work, great. When it's appropriate to do field work, because like you said, also very telling and important, right? And I would like to have him be this cute little dressage horse, but I also don't want to start him until he's like 4 or 5, because I want the time to build the relationship, to trust, to give his joints time to grow. He will be observing other horses that we're working with in the field. it's really important to me to use these principles to build that relationship before I even start kind of more training of getting on his back and stuff like that.
Totally. Yeah, exactly. The two are not incompatible. It just depends on where you're at and the rush that you've got, right?
Right. Well,
So,
I don't have a rush.
there you go. And that's what I mean. For me, it's like, well, how long did it take, Sarah? Well, you know, like, but I'm not in a rush. So to me, it doesn't matter. For me, the joy is the journey and
Right.
figuring it out and building of the relationship and learning about my horse's nervous system and making a more, if you could call it, a more secure attachment. The question as to whether horses can attach to humans in the way dogs do is still up for debate. I mean, that's one of the things I'm going to be looking into with my PhD research. The researcher that I'm wanting to study with, that's what she looks at, is it that horses can actually attach to humans, or is it that they have interaction patterns that have elements of attachment theory, but that they fully can't truly attach to a human the way dogs can? Again, because my theory is our piddly little bodies make us kind of puny and useless to horses, really, ultimately. And so therefore they're going to be more likely to be in their herd and have true attachment with herd members versus a primate, you know, and that's just, again, my theory on that. But so this idea of attachment, how do you support the attachment relationship? That's been my biggest joy with my own horse. You know, are we getting there fast? No. Do I care? No. Could this be a little faster? Maybe. But I'm also not pressured or any rush either.
Yeah.
You know, and I'm working with
that's a great thing.
You know,
the
and
good and the bad thing is that there's time.
there's time. Exactly. And like I said, take the time it takes, so it takes less time. There's a whole bunch of steps. Had we done this a little slower earlier, had we waited to get him started, we tried to get him started around 3 to 4, right? We weren't going to ride him regularly anyway. It was just to get him used to things and whatever. And at the time, I didn't know what I knew now. Well, I knew some things, but I wasn't trusting myself because I haven't been in the horse industry for 40 plus years, right? So I distrusted myself, put my faith in the trainer, and the trainer flooded my horse. Right?
Well, and draft horses take longer to mature.
That too, but my trainer didn't seem to understand this. So he would ask and increase the asks too much, too quickly, and my horse would get overwhelmed and developed a fear of objects. So, and he wasn't scared of objects before that. So we've worked really hard on establishing or repairing the I'm saying attachment relationship in quotation marks, because again, it's the jury's out on that so far. But if we could call it that it has elements of attachment, right, in our attachment with our horse-human relationship, how do I repair some of those injuries between my horse and I? Well, it's recognizing the no. It's recognizing when he gets stressed, where are his windows? How do I help him grow his window? Right? In somatic experiencing, it's not just about the pressure and the release and the little titrations, but it's also where are the resources, right? So in the face of the scary thing, what is the resource that helps you be with the scary thing? Well, that's where I found positive reinforcement and clicker training super duper helpful. Because in the face of the scary thing, now we've got this other thing that comes in, and now I have more confidence and, oh, okay. Or it's not just, oh, Sarah's getting annoyed because I'm not doing the thing that she asks. I'm actually reinforcing the behavior I want from him, so he knows, oh, when you do this, you want me to do that. And that's what you're asking. It's not just pressure release. I'm not telling him what not to do. I'm telling him what I want him to do instead.
Right. Oh, that's
and
amazing.
So, and all that stuff is just helping him feel less confused. Had we started from there years ago, had I used what I known years ago and applied it to him and not thought, well, I'm not a trainer, I shouldn't do this, we would be further along, I think, because he wouldn't have had gone through all this bad training around getting flooded and learning to be scared of things. Had we taken the time earlier.
Right.
I'm having to take the time now. Right?
Yeah.
So that's not it in a nutshell, but those are some really neat things I think about. And I think about this too, if I think about the training thing, you know how in the training world, because I know you had expressed a lot of interest, Lindsay, in terms of the training stuff, the horsemanship stuff, you know how there's like these two big camps, the natural horsemanship folks who are like all pressure releasey, and then we got the clicker training folks who are all like negative reinforcement's bad, and then the negative reinforcement people are like clicker training is just about treats, and and we got like these people throwing slings and arrows at each other all the time, and no one wants to talk to each other. So one of the things I really appreciated about learning a bit more about learning theory is that all of those things have a place in horse training.
Right.
clicker training / positive reinforcement and all the different reinforcements like differential reinforcement and overshadowing and counter conditioning and all these other bits and pieces totally have their place. And there's more to the reinforcement box than just negative and positive reinforcement. There's a whole bunch of cool stuff in there. So it's more than just those two. And it is those two. It's not one against the other. It's when do you use which one?
Right.
As opposed to one's bad and one's good and right? And so what's really been neat for me is going, okay, so the people from a somatic experiencing perspective, the people who tend to gravitate more towards negative reinforcement, pressure release only, and we don't think about the other quadrants or the other bits that are involved in learning theory, because we learn through those other methods as well. They're equally valid. All the horses in like, what's it called? Cavalia.
Mm-hmm.
All the Cavalia horses are trained by a combination of negative and positive reinforcement. All that trick stuff is all positive reinforcement, right? So, so when you think about it, it's like, okay, so those who are staunchly negative reinforcement, I go, what is it that allows you to experience? And what is it that doesn't allow, like, what does that allow you to avoid when you're doing negative reinforcement? What beliefs is that supporting for you, right? If it's just pressure release, that's all you do. And I go, what is it about the positive side of it, as in not positive as in good, but positive as in we're adding something that the horse wants, an appetitive, we're adding something the horse is looking forward to as opposed to removing something aversive. That's what, not positive and negative get a little confusing. What is it about that that's so off-putting, right? And then I think to myself, is that an early trauma thing where, you know, I wasn't allowed to have good things, or I was taught that you have to just put up and suck it up, and, you know, and you know, I wasn't treated with a soft hand, and so I've learned to be hard-handed with others, and it's always about the ask and the raising of intensity because there is no other way, and that is the way, and you have to learn how to do that. And you know what I mean? And then I think about the people who only do positive reinforcement, and then I think to myself, okay, is there in your history something that makes it scary for you to raise your voice? Because negative reinforcement is about releasing the pressure. What comes up for you when you think about bringing up your intensity, right? So from an SE standpoint, I go, wow, the nervous system of someone who completely maligns negative reinforcement and only goes towards clicker training to the exclusion of like, nothing else, just this, no. Like, yes, I get that there's science behind that, totally, 100%. And what is it about it for you that when you start to bring up your energy and make an ask, that you start to come into contact with that brings up activation? As you start to increase your intensity, what are you coming into contact with in your nervous system that's scary for you? Are you coming into contact with a thwarted fight response that you never got a chance to complete? How are you about raising, like making asks or requests in other places in your life, or setting a boundary, right? Or is it always just about, you know, being nice and kind and giving things and being a pleasant person, right? I'm not saying that's true of all people who are in clicker training. I'm also not saying all people who are into negative reinforcement had like harsh-handed training as parent, you know, they were parented with a heavy hand, or they're only ever parented with like, you know, you have to do the thing or else you don't get any kind of relief, right? I'm not saying that's always the case, but I get curious. What's the nervous system background of someone who self-selects in one or the other to the exclusion of having a broader view where all those things have a place? And I go, that's really interesting.
Yeah, you just blew my mind.
Yeah, totally, right? So for me, it's kind of like, you know, every nervous system is going to be different, right?
Yeah.
Like I said, every horse needs to know how to move away from pressure. That's super important, 100%.
Yeah.
You know, and then there's other things too that can be helpful, right? Negative reinforcement and positive reinforcement and all the other reinforcement schedules are all part of learning theory. All of it is helpful. And there are scientific studies that have been done showing what is helpful to do when. And it's so neat to look at that. So the SE part in that is, okay, where are the thresholds?
Right.
What are the resources needed to move to a bigger threshold? Do I need to add in a resource to help my horse get to this next threshold so it knows that it can actually do it? It can experience a sense of I can. Here's a classic example. So my horse, because of some of the things that have happened, was terrified of the mounting block, refused to stand at the mounting block. And we tried negative reinforcement over and over and over and over again. Stand here, it would move away. I would put the pressure back. No, stand here. that horse is terrified. That horse does not like the mounting block, right? It's got negative associations. I fell off that horse at that mounting block. Any mounting block now has come to be associated with fear. So I go, okay, so I can keep doing negative reinforcement and get nowhere because he just keeps moving away. Whenever the pressure is released, he just keeps drifting away from the mounting block again. I swear, Lindsay, years of negative reinforcement at the mounting block led me to nothing. 3 sessions of clicker training, and my horse has been fine with the mounting block for over a year.
Wow.
Stands there like there's no tomorrow. And the difference for me was there's a sense of I can't versus a sense of I can. Oh, I can do this. And look, here's the reinforcer. Oh, cool. Oh, right. Here's the resource. Here's the resource. Here's the resource. And then that grows the window of tolerance to be with the scarier thing. So how do we start working? It's like pressure release in combination with a resource. That's somatic experiencing in a nutshell. Little titrations of the nervous system, and where's the resource? And then and then you can grow that window to be with more things. It's so cool.
That is cool.
Yeah.
Kathy, I think we have time for one more question. Did you have one? You unmuted.
Kathy's just like licking and chewing.
Way more than one question. I've had questions going through my mind constantly.
Yeah, sure.
I guess you mentioned calming signals before, and I mean, I love Anna Blake, and I love natural lifemanship, and I see there's some places there where they feel like they're in conflict, because I hear her say a lot of times, just breathe, which I totally get. And then natural lifemanship says, make that ask and put on some pressure. So actually just now when you were talking, I think I made the connection that before we even ask for something, we need to build that rapport that it's not even about a request. It's just being willing to have both beings able to share a space safely and comfortably.
Think about it this way. I think you've nailed it. Yes.
And and that's really where the consent has to start.
Yes. If you think about it this way, there's a dog in a shelter cage. And that dog has had a bad experience of life, of people, whatever, and it's terrified of humans. Are you going to go in there and keep increasing the pressure until that dog comes over to hang out with you? Come on, let's go. We're going to, do you go into that cage and just keep increasing the intensity until the dog looks at you or comes over to you? Or do you kind of sit in the corner and just share space with it for a while? So it starts to learn to trust your nervous system, the predictability of your nervous system, the fact that you're not going to put any ask on it until it's ready to approach. There's certain things I can't do with certain clients until we've built the relationship. And that's consistent with ethology. If you look at ethology and equine ethology specifically, I love the work of Lucy Reese over in Spain. And if you can get her book, Horses and Company, I think you would certainly enjoy it. She looks at horses and how horses do relationship with each other. And this is also consistent with somatic experiencing. Horses in the wild have more affiliative behaviors than conflict behaviors, right? Because if you think about it, in the wild, you're going to survive more if your herd is cohesive and in harmony with itself than if there's a crap ton of infighting all the time. You need to reserve your infighting for the times that are absolutely necessary. Predators, other horses come in to steal the mares, pushing the junior bachelors out, right? Like there are times where you need the conflict behaviors, but the rest of the time you guys got to be living in an affiliation, because if you're wasting all your survival energy on infighting, you're not going to last very long as a herd, right? And so in ethology, there's this idea that how do we build relationship? How do horses do relationship? They're not touching all the time. They're not making requests of each other all the time. They're hanging out. They're grazing with each other. They might play. They might do nothing. And they graze. They do something called synchrony. They stand and they're grazing and they're facing the same direction, and then they cross each other's legs at the same time. You often see horses line up in synchrony or lie down in synchrony, and so it's not always about touch or asks. It's how are we mirroring each other, not mirror as in you're my mirror, but like how are we acting in synchrony, social cohesion. And that's how a herd experiences connection, is we're pinging off each other and we're feeling that sense of connection and that sense of cohesion in our synchrony. And so I think to myself, okay, that's what I do with my clients in my office. Before I do any technique-y bits or increase my ask in terms of, oh, hey, let's go and do some trauma work. We don't start with the trauma work. We start with laying the foundation. If my client has a terror of connection, I'm working with that before I'm going to start doing trauma memory work, right? I'm not going to increase my ask until we've got a foundation in place. Sometimes it's just about sitting with, and how do we tolerate that? And then they can start to read my nervous system, and it's like, oh, wow, okay, I can be with this. And what's really interesting is at the last Natural Lifemanship Conference in October, and maybe I'll end it on this point. I was co-facilitating my one day with Bettina. So Bettina and I were talking about polyvagal theory and how to bring that into the context of natural lifemanship. And it drew a lot from somatic experiencing and polyvagal work. And I talked about this whole idea of, when is it that you're making the ask? And when is it that when are you releasing the pressure? Is it when the horse gives you what you want as a result of the ask? Or is it when you hear the horse's no? And I said, there's a place for both. But I said, there are some horses' nervous systems that the release of the pressure has to come the second you see the no. And that was the way I learned equine assisted, whatever you want to call it. You start walking towards a horse at a distance, and the slightest, smallest sign that the horse is checking out, that's where I stop. Right? I'm catching the boundary ruptures from a distance. We're noticing, like, as I approach the horse, where are those holes in the boundary? Right? Where does the horse start to kind of either become activated or fearful or whatever? And it's like, oh, okay, right, okay, no problem. So as I start to walk, I see that you check out. Okay, we're going to pause here. And it might take like a while before I can actually approach that horse. That horse approaches me willingly. But it's the attunement. If that horse is a school horse who doesn't want to be a school horse, but has learned that it's had to do school horse work for 15 years, and so whenever a human approaches it, it just shuts down. And then whenever you make an ask, it just learns to go along with because that's what's expected. Is that a relationship, or is that a pattern? Right? And so I think to myself, okay, so the ask, yeah, there's a place for ask in any kind of work that we do, 100%. But recognize the nervous system. Is it appeasement? Is it shutting down? And in that case, you may want to start with, how do I show the horse that I can actually tell that it's saying no? And how can I show that horse that I can be that attuned to its no that I'm willing to back off and listen to its body language? And then maybe I start to gain that horse's respect, and it will probably be more willing to give a yes. And there's been some neat research looking at teaching horses to say yes or no using human signals. So they've done some clicker training and some positive reinforcement stuff around teaching a horse, like, here's two symbols on a piece of paper. Your nose on this one means yes, your nose on this one means no. Like, you can teach horses to communicate a yes or a no. And does a horse want to wear their winter blanket, yes or no? And it's been really neat to see how horses will choose what they want. They will actually communicate a yes or a no.
That would be really handy, because my horses tell me no, and I'm like, but it's really cold.
There's a really cute cartoon showing two horses, one horse in the wintertime with its winter fur, and the other horse not wearing a blanket. And the other horse is wearing a blanket, and the horse wearing the blanket looks annoyed and says, my human is cold.
Yeah.
Right? And it's like, so there's this neat thing around offering the horse choice. And equine behaviorist colleague of mine says, the fear is always, if you start offering your horse choice, that it will never want to go along with what you're asking it. If you start to give the horse a no, it will never give you a yes. And it's absolutely false. What she has found, and what I've certainly seen, is that time and time again, the more you allow the horse to have its no, as you're building the relationship, the more it's going to be willing and interested to want to spend time, and the more it's going to be willing to give you the yes when it's appropriate, right? Because we're doing that negotiation together, right? It's not always about, human gets their needs met. Yes, it is about sometimes what we need in a relationship, absolutely, but it's also what they need in a relationship too.
Yeah. Wow, that's Sarah. Oh, amazing. Well, definitely want to be respectful of time, but can you
Yeah.
tell everybody where we can find you?
Yeah, totally. So I have a couple websites. So the first one, which is my regular private practice, if you want to learn a little bit more about my other things that I do, because I do a lot of cool, fun stuff, is sarahschlote.com. So sarahschlote.com. And there is some stuff about the horse stuff on there, but largely that's my in-office practice. EQUUSOMA is the horse-related stuff. So EQUUSOMA, equus and soma. Soma meaning somatic, meaning of the body. And so that's the website with all this sort of stuff on it. The trainings for 2020 are listed. We're just in the process of having to rejig some of the training dates. Australian training dates are just going to be changed because of the bushfires and all the droughts and stuff. Everyone's like, can you move it to later in the year? We're still dealing with a lot of disaster stuff over here. So we're just in the process of changing some dates. But for those of you who are in the US, we are actually coming to the US this year. Woohoo! I know, first time.
We need to have a training down here in Texas.
Everyone keeps asking me. I know. I've been asked for Colorado. I've been asked for Pennsylvania. Oh, well, Pennsylvania is where we're going to be doing it this year. I've been asked for California. I've been asked for Texas. Lots of places. We want to do British Columbia at some time too, West Coast, because everyone's like, bring it to the West Coast. I can only do what I can do in a year. So
that's right. So if we can't make it to one of those, we shall be patient.
Yes. And what's really neat too is we're looking to put the fundamentals EQUUSOMA online. So I'm currently in the process of putting things up. Thanks to Tim and Bettina for paving the way in terms of excellence of online training modules. We're just in the process of putting up last year's trainings into an online format. So
perfect.
Yeah, if you can't make it to fundamentals in person, do fundamentals online and come join us.
Oh, that'll be just amazing. I am so excited about the work you are doing and the work that you are about to do with your PhD, and we cannot wait to see what the amazing Sarah Schlote comes up with next.
Well, thank you. I'm just grabbing people's stuff and putting it together and going, why aren't we putting this stuff together? So
well, that's
hopefully
needed.
It's helpful. There's meaningful that's meaningful. Yeah, that's meaningful.
All right. Well, Sarah, thank you so much. Kathy, Mary, you guys have been wonderful. And this was recorded, so great. I will be posting it tomorrow. And happy to send you a copy, Sarah, if you want to post it anywhere on your website.
Can this go on YouTube at all? Is there videos? Like, is this video filmed? MP4 format?
It is video film, so you can put it on YouTube.
I have the permission to put it. Perfect. Fantastic.
You have my permission, all of it.
Fabulous, darling. We will do that.
All right. Well,
Thanks
until
so
next
much,
time, guys. Thanks, guys.
Take care.
Thank you.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.